Spiritual formation can happen in many ways and in many different spaces, and different spiritual traditions emphasize some spaces over others. As an Anglican, we find that a lot of our spiritual formation happens through worship. We put a real emphasis on liturgy, at the high point being the Holy Eucharist, Holy Communion, when in an embodied way we receive the presence of God in bread and wine. In some traditions, spiritual formation happens through study of Scripture, or through private, personal devotions, one-on-one with God. Some traditions focus on small groups as a place for formation. I want to tell you about an experience that a small group had at Christ Church about a year ago. Small groups are not our primary way of forming each other in our spirituality, but we found this to be a really rich opportunity for us. A group of 12 of us committed to meet every 2 weeks for a 12-session course around spiritual practices. And we used a little book called Spiritual Classics, edited by Richard Foster and Emily Griffin. And the book is organized around 12 spiritual disciplines, things like meditation and fasting, prayer, service, confession. And for each one of the practices, there were excerpts from classic spiritual writing, from big names like Martin Luther King Jr., St. Augustine, Hildegard of Bingen, Dorothy Day. And so we would select a reading. So perhaps we wanted to read Thomas Merton on meditation. And so for a week leading up to our meeting, each one of us would study the reading, we'd read it through, we'd think about it, we'd look over some discussion questions that came in the book, and we'd prepare for our conversation. Then when we got together, we'd talk about it. How did this reading resonate with you? How did it challenge you? What surprises were there for you? What did you find yourself reacting against? And we'd have these great wide-ranging conversations and sometimes great debates. We didn't always agree on what we were seeing and what we were reading. It made for a rich encounter, listening to each other's stories and experiences of these readings. We had this great intellectual conversation around it. But then our conversation turned to practice. How do we meditate? How do we do that? What would it look like in our lives? And we would commit to spend the next week engaging in that spiritual practice. So we'd carve out 5 minutes each day to try on meditation as a practice. And when we got together again next time, we'd talk about how it went. We'd reflect. Was that a life-giving practice? Was it challenging? Is it something I'd like to keep trying, or is it something I'd like to never try again? And again, there was a variety of experiences. Some people would have had a great experience with a practice, and someone else would have said it was the hardest thing they'd ever tried. And we'd have this space to have these open conversations. And we found that there was a lot of growth there. There was a lot of spiritual formation to be had in these conversations. And so as I've been reflecting on that experience, I think of 2 things that really supported the success of that group. The first was that we had a group where there was trust. Now, we didn't all know each other before we started on this journey together. So we had to lay some ground rules for how we would do this together well, so that we could really open up, because we're talking about personal things when we're talking about spiritual formation. And so confidentiality, of course, was very important. What's said in the group stays in the group. We only tell our own stories. We don't tell other people's stories. Because we often like to disagree, we promised that we would presume good faith in the other, that they're not just disagreeing with us to try and stir things up, but that they come to their position in a sincere way. And we made sure that no one hogged the conversation or imposed an agenda on it, and especially the leader. The leaders can impose their agendas, but we didn't want to do that. Not everyone had to come to the same conclusions or get to the same place, but we wanted to create an open space where people could explore spirituality together in a safe way. So that was really important. The second thing that supported the success of this group was the ways that we, in unplanned ways, ended up being a surprise to us, we drew on different strands from within our own tradition. So one strand of the Anglican tradition is a love of the mind and the use of the mind in worship and in faith. And one of our favorite sayings is, when you come to church, you don't have to check your brain at the door. And so we loved having this really good intellectual conversation around what we had read, and to really wrestle it through intellectually, loving God with our minds. But it didn't stop there. We also then had this embodied practice, and embodiment in our spirituality is so important. As Anglicans, we talk about being sacramental and incarnational, and having an embodied practice to go along with the intellectual conversation was really important. And as these two strands from within our tradition came together, we found real great fruit. So I leave you with this question. In your tradition or in your congregation, what are the primary places where spiritual formation happens? And if there are multiple strands for spiritual formation within your tradition, are there ways to bring them together, creative ways to bring them together, where you might find unexpected fruit?